evidence better, and they can also have the capacity to consume that evidence as well as run their own evaluations. Speaking of the kind of methodology that Tanishq alluded to as well, so JPAL researchers use a type of methodology called a randomized evaluation to tease out the causal impact of programs. So essentially how this works is that before a program starts, individuals in a certain population are sampled and then they are randomly assigned to two groups. And if these groups are kind of large enough, then due to the law of large numbers, what essentially happens is that you have two groups which are statistically identical to each other on average. So while individual characteristics might differ, they would on average have kind of the same socioeconomic or educational background. And that I think is really important, this process of randomization. After that, the program is given to one of these groups, whereas the other group, which is the comparison group, does not receive the program. So here, the only difference between these two groups, all else equal, is the fact that one group has received this program. So what this allows us to do over a certain period of time, like end of the study period, we measure outcomes. Say you're measuring kind of nutritional outcomes between two groups. So you measure those outcomes at the end of the study period, and you can then confidently kind of attribute these outcomes entirely to the program, because as we know, those two groups were similar to each other at the outset. So that's a quick recap of the methodology. And coming to our discussion today, I thought since this is an introductory kind of discussion, we'll start by understanding what exactly universal basic income means, and what are some of the examples of UBI experiments that have taken place across the world, as well as some of the proposals that have been put forward in India also. And then I'd like to spend some time just talking about what we know about UBI right now and what we don't know about UBI, and basically, seeing where the global evidence and even local evidence on UBI comes from. So that will give us a better understanding of some of the, arguments for and against UBI. So they can be supported with this kind of evidence. And lastly, I'd just like to take you through some of the key design and implementation aspects of UBI. So this is, for any government, this will be a huge undertaking. So what are some of the design details that policymakers might have to think about, and what are some of the prerequisites to implementation that policymakers have to think about? So let's start with defining universal basic income, right? So it is a guaranteed recurring payment to every member of society without terms and conditions, sized to meet basic needs. So this is a definition from the World Bank, and here you can already see that there are a lot of different features that pop out. So the first is that it is universal, which means everybody in a country or a state will get it, regardless of whether they apply for it, regardless of any other, that there are no eligibility conditions which would include some people and exclude some people. So every individual member gets it. It's also unconditional, so you may know about conditional cash transfers and unconditional cash transfers, and a UBI is purely unconditional, which means that the recipient of a UBI can use that for any purpose that they wish to. So it does not come with any conditions of behaving a certain way or having to do some work in order to receive this payment. So it's unconditional. It's also recurring, so usually it is at a monthly basis. It's given out in cash, as opposed to giving out some in-kind transfers, like you can think of PDS rations as an in-kind transfer. So instead of that, it is purely a cash transfer. And it's also paid to the individual. So there are also social protection programs which are paid at the household level, and usually it's given to the woman head of household. But a UBI, like a pure definition of a UBI, by virtue of being universal and having to reach every member of society, means that it has to be paid to the individual. And finally, the last feature is that it's sized to meet basic needs. Essentially, it should be enough in amount to kind of meet an individual's basic needs like housing, food, clothing, etc. And what exactly is this money expected to do in the hands of these individuals, and why is it such a powerful concept? Is that as I said, it does not come with any conditions. So an individual is empowered to spend it the way they want, and be it health, or be it on education, or be it on any kind of just increasing your dietary diversity and going to the market and buying more foods than you used to, or different kinds of foods than you used to. So all of that will in turn have impacts on a person's income, a person's saving, investment levels, human capital like health and education, consumption levels. So it's the theory of change here is that that money in the hands of individuals can spur sort of demand in the economy more generally, and also lead to better individual developmental outcomes for people. So going back, also going a little ahead and thinking about, what are the different goals that a UBI can achieve. So this varies with respect to context, high income, low income countries, the kind of objective that you want to meet with a UBI will really inform the design of it and inform the amounts that you give out. So in high-income countries, for example, it could be a way to counter the effects of automation and job loss, which is created because of rapid technological advancement. In resource-rich countries or states, it can be given out as a dividend, which essentially means that all the profits or the revenues that a state is making from its natural resources, like oil or mineral wealth, that's kind of that's redistributed. So it's a manner of redistributing this national wealth to the citizens of that country. So it's given out as a dividend. And the third goal could be to just alleviate poverty or get everyone to up to a certain adequate standard of living, right? So in that case, it's used as a social assistance tool. And this is, I guess, very much in like developing countries and countries such as India. You can think of UBI as a social assistance tool. And UBI as a concept is also unique in the way that it receives support from a wide variety of actors. So be it, people in the US, like these tech magnates thinking of UBI as a way to offset job losses, or you can think of certain sections of the political spectrum who say that current social protection systems are extremely paternalistic and they impose a lot of conditions on people. So in order to remove that state interference, they could consider UBI. Some policymakers or governments can also use UBI as a way to increase citizen and state trust. So the fact that you're receiving a benefit regularly, reliably from the government can actually increase that state citizen trust and improve governance outcomes more generally. And then there can also be certain sections of the political spectrum who want to kind of improve the bargaining power of workers by giving them this extra cash infusion or by taking care of their basic needs so that they don't have to work in dismal conditions in factories or manufacturing centers. So as I said, like the key point here is that it receives support from a wide variety of political actors across the spectrum. And it's very important to keep in mind that a UBI can achieve different goals in different contexts. So let me just summarize the debate, and this we can also go into more detail in the discussion. But what are some of the arguments that proponents of UBI use, and what are some of the arguments that critics use? So in terms of arguments for, so universal transfers can lower administrative costs. Essentially, governments right now spend a lot of time in verifying eligibility, in authenticating beneficiaries, in ensuring that they are meeting the conditions for the cash transfer. So there are a lot of administrative costs currently, which can be lowered, if not completely done away with, can be definitely lowered by using universal transfers. It can also reduce discretion by authorities who currently have, a lot of power in deciding whom to include in the beneficiary list and whom to exclude. So by making it universal, there won't be any discretion by authorities to kind of include and exclude people. And related, it reduces exclusion errors by the fact that everyone gets it, so it doesn't really exclude anybody. It also can remove the stigma of receiving social assistance. So, for some people, it might be a matter of shame to go and apply and receive government assistance. But when everyone is kind of getting it, that kind of stigma would be reduced. And of course, in as recent times have shown us, there is like cash transfer schemes have multiplied by many times since COVID-19 struck. So it can actually provide a sort of a safety net in terms of in times of crisis like COVID-19. But there are also kind of valid arguments on against UBI, and chief among them is that actually a targeted approach might be better at addressing the needs of the actual poor. So think of a government that is deciding to universalize versus deciding to target the poorest and addressing their needs. So what will end up happening, especially in developing countries with limited budgets, is that they would have to reduce the amount given per head in order to universalize. So in order to have everyone in the scheme, they would have to reduce the per head amount of the transfer. Whereas when you're targeting, you have enough money to address the needs of the poor and increase the per head amount that is given out. So in that way, to kind of increase or reduce poverty rates and actually meet the needs of the poorest households, a targeted approach might actually lead to better outcomes for them. And then there are unknown effects of replacing large-scale welfare schemes, which kind of developing countries would have to do in order to finance a UBI. And think of replacing something like the PDS or the Manrega with a UBI. I mean, we don't know what kind of effect that would have. And then the cost of financing a UBI is really high, and we can go into more detail later about what are the considerations that go into it and how countries can actually go about financing it. But for developing countries, the costs will be fairly high, and they would have to make some politically challenging decisions as well. And then another sort of concern critics have is that you're giving unconditional cash transfers to people, but you don't know how they're going to use it. So they might use it on temptation goods, or so-called vice goods like alcohol and tobacco. And that's definitely not something that policymakers intend it to be used for. So there is that concern as well. And overall, I think there is just a lack of evidence on UBI, because there have been very few pure UBI schemes across the world, or programs across the world. And we just don't know enough about what kind of an impact it would have when large sections of the population get it, or what effects it would have on the economy. Could it drive inflation, or could it reduce labor supply? These are some questions that still need sort of conclusive answers before we can recommend it. So I think here we'll just take a quick look at what are the examples of UBI from around the world. And in India, even though we've had one very, very small pilot of UBI, there are just ideas and proposals by political parties and by economists as well. So we'll just take a quick look at those. So as I said before, the concept of UBI has gained prominence, especially in the wake of COVID-19 disruptions. And there can be different policy drivers and motivations to explore UBI depending on your context. And across the world, there have been only two countries, Iran and Mongolia, which have experimented with a full-scale UBI program that was rolled out nationally for everyone. And everywhere else where it has been experimented, it has either been geographically restricted or it has been targeted to a certain section of the population. So in Finland, it was towards unemployed people. In Kenya, it's towards people who are living in these two districts. So there's a lot of variation of UBI and UBI pilots, but in terms of full-scale UBI programs which are national in nature, only two countries have done that so far. And both had to be discontinued because of inflation, and because people were not happy with the amount of transfers that they were getting. And in India, what we see is that discussions on UBI and UBI type experiments has been proposed both at the center and the state governments. And we'll just take a closer look at that. So the most, I would say, prominent proposal that has been put forth was in the Economic Survey in 2016-17. And while this was not a full-fledged UBI, it was a quasi-UBI which would be targeted towards the bottom 75% of the income distribution by giving out rupees 7,600 per year to each individual. So this kind of set the ball rolling in terms of people talking about UBI, how it could be kind of implemented in India, what would be the different amounts that people would give, and what consequences that would have to our fiscal budgets, right? So there are UBI proposals ranging from rupees 13,432 per year, which would allow people to come to the Tendulkar poverty line. And there's also other more kind of restricted UBI variants, which would be given only to widows, elderly, disabled, and pregnant women, which would be around rupees 12,000 per year for pensions and rupees 6,000 per child in maternity benefits. And this would cost about 1.5% of the GDP, whereas something that costs rupees 13,000 per year, that would be around 11% of GDP, which is massive, and there's just not enough fiscal space to make that happen. So, and another, of course, famous one is the one proposed by the Indian National Congress in 2019, which is not a UBI, it's a guaranteed minimum income, which means that 20% of the poorest 20% of the households would be given 72,000 per year. And this was basically keeping in mind that, the median income is rupees 12,000. All these households earn less than that. They earn around rupees 6,000. So giving them that difference in order to get them to that common minimum floor. That was the idea behind Nyay, which is a little different from a typical UBI. And I was also alluding to one pilot which has actually been conducted, and this was by Seva in Madhya Pradesh, where monthly payments were given to adults and children ranging from 200 to 300 rupees per month and 100 to 150 per child. And this was a very small pilot covering just 6,000 individuals in 20 villages in Madhya Pradesh, but it actually showed quite promising results on a host of development outcomes, and we can discuss this also later. And more recently, just in the past year or so, and possibly driven by the impacts of COVID, several states have also announced or promised quasi-UBI schemes. So in West Bengal, they've gone ahead and launched a scheme called Lakshmi Bhandar, which would give a small cash infusion to families, around 1.6 crore families. And it's very minimal, rupees 500 per month for general category households and rupees 1,000 for SC/ST households. And similarly in Tamil Nadu, they are considering giving rupees 1,000 per month to women heads of households. In Assam, there is already an ongoing scheme which provides 830 rupees per month per household. And in Sikkim, this is one of the few states which thought about UBI quite early on, but they've still not operationalized it, is providing rupees 1,500 per month for all individuals in Sikkim, which would come up to about 5% of their GDP. So these are some of the different kind of modalities and designs that the state governments are thinking about in India. So going another step forward and looking at, what does the evidence say, and what do we sort of know about UBI, what do we not know, and where is more research needed? So as I said, a pure UBI has not been very rigorously evaluated. The most recent example I can think of is the Finland example, where only 2,000 unemployed individuals were given cash transfers per month for a period of 2 years, and now the results are just coming out. But going back and taking a step back and just looking at the evidence that is there on cash transfers more broadly, both conditional and unconditional, it shows that cash transfers have positive impacts on several development outcomes. So this could be poverty alleviation, health, education, school enrollments, women empowerment, and reduction in intimate partner violence, and better sort of investment in productive assets. So cash transfers can be used to drive a lot of different incomes and different outcomes, and that's what we've seen, largely a positive impact of cash transfers. And a review of these studies also shows that these concerns around people using cash transfers for temptation goods is not well founded. It's actually doesn't exist, and in some cases they actually reduce their expenditure on temptation goods. And there's also the other concern of people reducing their labor supply or people not working as much because they are receiving this unconditional cash transfer, and that is also kind of debunked because people either remain at the levels or increase their labor supply in response to receiving transfers. And there's also a question of what happens in the long term. So do effects, the short-term effects, do they continue to be seen in the long term? And one study can point us to the direction that yes, unconditional cash transfers do lead to large increases in consumption, food security, and assets, even 3 years after the program first began. And the people and the recipients just received it for 9 months, but the impact of that cash transfer was prevalent even 3 years later. And then there's also this question on, does providing this kind of cash assistance, can it kind of help people weather shocks like COVID-19? And we have seen from one study conducted in Kenya that it did have positive impacts on food security. So people, did not go hungry. Their physical and mental health was better compared to non-recipients. So it kind of, but the incomes that they had got, that they had managed to earn from before COVID-19 had to be depleted. But in terms of, at least food security and physical mental health, those impacts were preserved. And then there's also very interesting work done by the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economics winner, Guido Imbens, who takes people who won lotteries in Massachusetts as his treatment group, as his group to study, and sees what kind of effects that extra income had on them. And I think he also finds that they do not, there's not much significant change in people's labor supply. So they continue working the way they were before. So this is kind of the research that we have, but there are still a lot of open questions. And There is one interesting pilot that is happening in Kenya right now, which can actually help us answer these important questions. So this is a randomized evaluation of UBI currently ongoing in 2 districts in Kenya, which is led by JPAL affiliates Abhijit Banerjee, Paul Niehaus, and Tufts University. So here, what the researchers did is that they partnered with an NGO called Give Directly, which essentially gives money from donors and deposits them directly into the bank accounts of recipients, and it's transferred through mobile money. And what they did was work with Give Directly to choose 295 villages, which they then sort of randomly assigned to 4 groups. So the first group was to receive $23 per month at the individual level, again, for 12 years. The next group was to receive it for only 2 years. So we're looking at the differences between short-term UBI and long-term UBI. And they also gave a lump sum UBI, which was rupees $500 as a one-off. And there was then the remaining were sort of in a comparison. So what the researchers hope to answer is what are people going to do with this kind of money? What do they do with it when you give it as a lump sum versus what do they do with it when you give it as monthly payments? What are the impacts this could have on their savings, their investment, their incomes? What financial choices do they make? So do they, sort of, because they have this kind of security of money in their bank accounts, do they go out and diversify their occupations, or do they make more investments in their jobs or enterprises or farms? And what kind of financial choices do they make? Do they sort of go to more formal banking systems because now they have this flow of money, and that can give the bankers kind of a little bit more confidence in lending to such people. So there are a whole host of questions, and of course they're watching it over 12 years, which means that we'll also probably start seeing some impacts for the children who are currently receiving these transfers. So there are a lot of interesting questions that this pilot can answer, and yeah, I think it would be really interesting when those results come up. And finally, I think what I wanted to touch upon is, suppose you have all the evidence and UBI sounds like a good idea, but there are still a lot of challenges. In fact, the challenges are just starting, right? Like there are a lot of considerations that policymakers would have to take into account. So the first thing that they would need to figure out is, what are the needs of the population? So are we sort of raising them to a common minimum floor? Are we giving everybody kind of the same amount? What is the actual objective of this UBI? And that is something that people would need to figure out. And then comes the, determining what should be the benefit level, what should be, is it enough for people to do what is intended? And what should be the frequency of these transfers? And there's also the all-important question of how do you finance a UBI? And then implementing a UBI through various payment delivery systems, that would also require a lot of prerequisites that we will see. So what should the amount be? As we have seen in the previous examples that I shared for proposals in India, there are different amounts and people have arrived at these in different ways. But there are two major things, two ways to think about setting that amount. One is to have a fixed budget. For example, the Nyaya scheme proposes rupees 6,000 per household, and that is comes up to 1.9% of the national income. But as the national income grows, this amount will remain the same. So overall, the scheme expenditure will fall along the years. The other thing that governments can do is to peg the cash transfer scheme to X% of the nation's GDP. So, for example, there is one proposal from Professor Karthik Muralidharan, also a JPAL affiliate, which is called Inclusive Growth Dividend. And they the researchers peg the cash transfer scheme budget to be 1% of the nation's GDP. So this means that as the GDP grows, the transfer amount also grows, and the dividends of this national growth are shared among all the citizens. So yeah, two ways to think about what exactly the transfer amount should be. I think a more difficult question is how can it be financed? So there are, again, two ways to think about this. One is policymakers might choose to keep a budget neutral financing, or they may want to increase government spending and go through the non-budget neutral financing route. So a budget neutral financing means that a government would kind of reduce expenditures here, raise finances there, or do some kind of changes to the composition of the fiscal expenditures, but the fiscal budget to GDP would remain the same. There would be no change. But in a non-budget neutral financing, the government expenditure would increase, so your fiscal budget to GDP ratio would also increase. And this is really important, right? Because a government would have to justify to their citizens, to the political leaders. They would have to justify why this, where this increase is coming from, how are they going to fund it, if they're making any changes to the fiscal budget to GDP ratio. And the ways that governments can go about trying to actually fund something like this is firstly to cut expenditures, and this can happen in different ways. For example, you can reform some subsidies which are going to the non-poor households or to the middle class, and in India that would be something like the LPG, or railway tickets, for example, things which are going to the middle class, but they don't really deserve these kind of subsidies, or they can afford to give them up. So it could start with cutting expenditures there, or governments can try to raise revenue by broadening the tax base or increasing tax rates. And then they would have to think about which tax rate to increase. Like, should it be personal income? But then that will really hit people hard, and it may be politically challenging. Same thing with like wealth and property tax, very politically challenging. They could try increasing corporate rates, tax rates, or they could try kind of increasing consumption taxes, but then that will kind of affect the poorest the most. So there are different ways to think about it, and all of the experts that I had mentioned before, they have also suggested many ways to finance it. So some people suggest rolling back some subsidies, not completely cutting them out, but rolling them back for especially those which are going to the non-poor, such as fuel, fertilizer, electricity. And to make it more financially manageable, governments can also consider giving out smaller amounts which can be paid universally, but then encouraging the rich to kind of opt out by making it more difficult for them to, making it more cumbersome for them to access the benefits, or just starting like a voluntary opt-out program. So those are different ways in which governments can think about financing it. Of course, like, I don't have all the answers, but yeah, this is just like an introduction into just the considerations of how governments can go about this. And finally, I think very important is that, how can a UBI be delivered such that it is reaching the recipients in a regular and reliable way? So for this, the Economic Survey 2016-17 suggests that governments will, first need to identify beneficiaries, then it will need to transfer that money to beneficiaries, for which it needs a really strong public finance management system, and making sure that, it goes all the way from the treasury to the bank account of an individual person. That is a huge and long chain, and it can be kind of very complicated to pull off. And then, of course, beneficiaries must be able to access their money. It does nobody any good by just sitting in their bank accounts. So that would require a really strong payments infrastructure. So in India, we can think about direct benefit transfer systems, which are leveraging the Jandhan Aadhaar mobile trinity. So we can think about how DBT has become so ubiquitous in social protection in India that people are there are a host, there are like hundreds of DBT cash transfer schemes. So while that infrastructure does exist, in order to kind of expand it to all of India, that would put a really kind of pressure on the banking systems. So it's very important to have to make sure that everyone that you plan to reach out to has a bank account and has a way to access that money. And this could be through banking correspondence, kiosks in villages, or even your kirana shop, which would act as a cash in, cash out. It would act as an ATM. So all of these kind of last mile, so right from first mile to last mile, all of these kind of implementation challenges exist, and those would need to be really ironed out before anything like a UBI can be considered. And finally, having a really strong monitoring system is really important, because governments would need to know whether the money has actually reached the bank accounts. There needs to be a robust grievance redressal system in case people are not receiving it, or in case there is some authentication failure, or any kind of last mile issues. So a robust monitoring system is also something that needs to be in place before UBI can be considered. So I think I'll stop over there, and we can get into a discussion. I hope I didn't take too long. But in terms of additional reading, I just wanted to share a couple of important documents and important papers with you, which can help understand UBI a lot better. So I hope this is helpful, and I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, sorry, I think we have only 17 minutes left before I have to drop out for another call. But yeah, I think I welcome questions, but more than that, I think I'd just like to hear what you guys think about universal basic income. Is it powerful? What kind of effects can it have? What kind of concerns do you think it raises, especially in a country like India?
Right. Yeah. Right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for that presentation. Also, regarding the paucity of time, we're actually free. So if it's not a problem, we can stay a little longer as well. So indeed, first, before we begin the next section of our event, I really want to thank you for that presentation. As students of different disciplines here, who are not necessarily very familiar with advanced economics, or at least undergraduate level economics, I think you adequately simplified these complex topics so that even we could understand. And personally, it's always, as a non-economic student, it's challenging for me to understand economics, but still I think I could understand everything that you said in your presentation. And I really like the fact that it in a way answered the curiosities that I had during the presentation midway at the end. So I had a lot of questions about the JAM Trinity, financial inclusion, as well as target delivery and all of that. And I think that the presentation adequately answered those questions at the end. So let's move to the next part of the of our today's event, that is the discussion. And I'm sure that a lot of us have many questions for ma'am, as well as to share their own opinions on the issue. So, ma'am, I think I have two questions. So, very interesting. India's food security system, right from the PDS, which was universal in its nature when it comes to coverage. Then we have the revamped PDS, and then the targeted PDS, and then different additions, Antayojana scheme, and then more recently in 2012 or 13, I think we had the National Food Security Act. So, and much more recently, the government has released the Poshan Abhiyan, which focuses on quote unquote nutritional security. So, And also, I would like to add another small fact, which the Economic Survey of India last year pointed out. I think it said that one of the key recommendations to ensuring inclusive food security is to reduce the coverage of National Food Security Act from 70% of the population to 20% only. So when we're talking about reduced role of the state, what would be a better approach? Would universal basic income suffice here? I know that the evidence is inconclusive still, but on the face of it, would removing the leakages and bottlenecks in the current system be a better off version of a solution than UBI, or it is the other way around when we talk about food and nutritional security?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And and I think that is the key question almost, because food, fertilizer, electricity subsidies kind of take up around 2.7% of the GDP. So even if you reduce them by a little bit, say you reduce it to 1% of GDP, then you have enough fiscal space to implement a UBI and kind of offset the losses that people may face from reduced grains or reduced rations by giving them an extra infusion of cash, which they are free to spend on. So, I mean, it's an extremely macro decision, and I don't think I'm well placed to comment on which one is better. But I do think that replacing the PDS or even and it also goes back to like the kind of improvements the PDS has made, right, over the last 10 years, let's say. I mean, there is Aadhaar-based biometric authentication, all of this has been digitized. And while there are still issues with authentication, biometric authentication, and that should not be the only way to verify beneficiaries, because that does lead to genuine, exclusion of genuine beneficiaries, it has made a lot of progress. So the kind of leakages that, say, the Economic Survey was thinking about back in 2016-17, and saying that PDS has a lot of leakages, has a lot of misallocation, those problems have been reduced to a certain extent. So I think reducing, so I think it could go both ways. Like, you could kind of invest more effort into improving the current schemes. And PDS is like a very, very important scheme for India, and rolling it back or even reducing it without completely taking stock of how it's functioning right now is ill-advised for sure. And also, we have to think about, there are places in rural areas, for example, where the markets may not be very well connected. So giving so much cash, or giving whatever amount of cash that people are thinking of, to these areas will actually not be very good, because it's hard for them to go out and buy. There's not enough choice. It could lead to things like inflation. So in rural areas especially, I think it needs to be carefully considered whether reducing the number of PDS beneficiaries is advisable, because a lot of people depend on it just for their daily needs. So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. So I just have a very quick question, and this is just off the top of my head. So while researching about or just casually reading about UBI, sadly I did not come across the opt-out mechanism which you talked about in your presentation. And that is, I think, very intriguing, because it, in a way, is a viable solution to reducing the fiscal burden of the government. And at the same time, I think it is also putting pressure on the individual to make a conscious choice whether as to avail state benefit or not. So this is just again top of my head. Do we have any observations or understandings from the LPG subsidy opt-out option that we have recently? And if yes, then can it be implemented in UBI or something like that?
Yeah, I think the LPG one is a really good example of people who don't want it giving it up. And I think the way to do that, and I don't know if they did this in LPG necessarily, but the way to do that, just from reading experts who propose this kind of thing is to make it cumbersome for people who don't really need it. So, for example, you could increase the number of times you verify yourself as a beneficiary. So, a person who doesn't really need 100 rupees per month will not go to the trouble of going and authenticating themselves, or withdrawing it from an ATM. That will not be so putting in these small hurdles such that people who really need them will go and get them, but people who don't need them will not spend any time on doing that. So I think those are sort of some behavioral things that you can include to help people, to urge people to opt out.
Right. Thank you.
I'm not very sure of what has been done in LPG. I think mainly it was just a voluntary thing, and it was mainly about a mass communication project of telling people to opt out.
Right. So if anyone has a question for ma'am, please feel free to ask.
Good evening, ma'am. I would like to thank you for that very enlightening presentation from you. My question was regarding financing the scheme of universal basic income, and if the government uses a fiscal expansionary policy, what will be the right monetary policy to accompany it with?
I would have to say I do not know much about that exactly, but I can always find out more and let you know.
Right, ma'am.
All right. That's all right. So if anyone else has a question or just want to make a point or something like that.
Also, another very important point that the economic survey mentioned about having efficient public finance system. So in recent times, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government has initiated various schemes like the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, in which a part of which also dealt with distributing 500 rupees to the women accounts of PM Chandan Yojana accounts. Also, implementation of PM Kisan Yojana, which is dealing with sending 2,000 rupees per quarter to per 4 months to a very large number of people. So I think we are progressing towards a very efficient manner of distributing such benefits directly into the bank accounts, especially after the post pandemic, or I would say after COVID hit us. I think the government have really started using DBT in its real form, because earlier, even when we are looking at Manrega, it used to be the Gram Pradhan's approval that led to the DBT, but now there is no certain restrictions on that.
Right. Thanks, Avnendra. So if anyone has anything to add or maybe ask a question to ma'am or just make a point about universal basic income, please feel free to do so.
Good evening, ma'am. I had a question. In 2019, Sikkim Democratic Front released its manifesto where it mentioned about a rather universal basic income, where it focused on giving almost 90,000 rupees to everyone in Sikkim. And as per the World Bank report, they set the bar for India as rupees 78,000 per annum. And this would actually mean that everyone in that state would be above the poverty line. And the similar attempt was also made by Congress when they released the Nyuntam Aay Yojana. But ma'am, what's interesting to me here is that these policies or these intentions weren't enticing enough for people to actually make sure that they win the elections. For example, Congress, of course, wasn't universal, it was just for 20%. So still we can understand. But in Sikkim, ma'am, Sikkim Kranti Front came to the power. Sikkim Revolutionary Front came to power, rather than the Sikkim democratic one. So, ma'am, what do you think? Does these examples present a bigger picture which we can actually analyze to understand what would India's reaction be to a universal basic income?
Yeah, and I think that's also another really key point, right? Like before introducing a UBI, a government has to be very clear with what objectives it's trying to meet. So in Sikkim, I think the narrative was around providing youth with a steady income so that they can, go ahead and look for more opportunities and things like that. So governments would have to be very careful and very clear about the objective, and they would have to communicate. I think the most important thing whenever any reform is announced is its communication and the way it's communicated to at least the intended beneficiaries or those who are supposed to be paying for it. So, for example, the rich and the middle class, how would they react to something like this, where benefits are going to only a certain section of the society and they're essentially paying for it? So it may have been that, it wasn't very politically feasible or politically powerful enough message, both from the Congress and the SDF, and people wouldn't really know what the outcomes of this would be. Again, that's another thing where evidence can really help, is that, for them it would seem like you're just giving free cash to people, and there's this myth that people will use it for alcohol and tobacco. That's, I think, the first reaction that people would get. So I think all these things would have to be communicated to people in order to receive some kind of popular support for it, and then for it to actually translate into votes. And we can look at other countries where, for example, in Iran and Mongolia, ultimately they had to be rolled back because of public dissatisfaction with those schemes, because the amount was just not enough. Iran was facing sanctions, which drove prices up. Mongolia had pegged it to their mineral wealth, so when the prices of copper fell, that again reduced the amounts that. So yeah, I think it has to be very clearly communicated in order to receive any kind of widespread support.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. So, ma'am, is it possible for you to take another question?
Yes, I think I can take just one more, but I have to drop off at 5:30.
All right. If anyone has a question.
Good evening, ma'am.
Yeah, Soham. All right, go ahead.
Ma'am,
okay. Let's take. Let's take a question from Abhilasha, if that's all right, Soham. Abhilasha, please ask your question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon. Thank you for the lovely presentation. It was really resourceful and insightful. My question is that usually what happens with a lot of government programs, especially if there are unemployment allowances or if there are like direct benefit transfers, especially in rural areas, the power play of the panchayats, or usually those in power, come into picture, and then they never get actually trickle down to the lower section of the society, because usually they end up being like to the families of panchayats, or the benefit of the program get a little skewed in terms of distribution. And especially when we're talking about universal basic income, the distribution has to be like mass level to every individual who needs it, and at that time distribution of that benefit becomes a really important issue that the government needs to resolve. So how do you think we can go about that?
So I think your question is basically about how to prevent kind of elite capture by people in the villages. Yeah, and I think that's a really huge concern, and that's exactly what happened with Manrega, where someone had alluded to that before. And in 2017 or 18, they changed the way that the money is routed so that all these middlemen are cut out and it just goes directly from the state treasury to the individual's bank account. And now that again, like just the scope of that and to figure that out and to make that happen, the governments right now, they use the PFMS system. I forget what the full form is, but yeah, they use the PFMS system to make sure that the money goes directly into the bank accounts. And directly sending the money to the bank account has actually shown to improve outcomes, especially for women, because now they have more control over their earned income. So earlier they used to work for Manrega, but the wages used to go to the head of the household's account, or this family account, which would be just operated by the men. So by linking women's individual accounts to their Manrega payments, that is something, again, the central government has taken cognizance of, and it has kind of driven that as well through Jan Dhan. So I think just what's really needed is more, the system is there, but what's really needed is more financial inclusion. So more people having bank accounts, more people knowing how to use it. That's really important, especially for women, and more people having access to it, as we have access to ATMs. So think of rural areas having kiosks, payment shops, kirana stores, CSCs. So all of that needs to be strengthened, definitely at the last mile, because as we know, Jan Dhan accounts, most of them do end up remaining dormant. And by the very fact of having a UBI, that is also one of, financial inclusion is one of the expected outcomes of UBI, because you're sending someone money month in, month out. So that bank account does not remain dormant anymore. It is at least receiving transfers. And when you combine that with financial literacy programs and training for women to use it, or people to use it, then it would also, and making it easier for people to use it by like providing these mobile ATMs and things like that, that can actually solve the demand issue as well. Yes, and the system, banking system does exist, so we just need these extra sort of policy pushes to realize those outcomes.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. Although I would have hoped that we could discuss this issue more extensively, but nevertheless, we understand.
I know. I was told it's a 1 hour, so unfortunately, I fixed something up for 5:30. So
right, ma'am. That's all right. We understand you are very busy as company.
But you are more than welcome to write to me. My email was there, but I can also send it to the caucus, and you have that. So yeah,
actually, there were a few texts about your presentation. So people, like our members, really liked your presentation, and especially the last part wherein you put in the additional readings.
Yeah, I can just send that across to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So I'm really hoping that I won't take more than 30 seconds of your precious time now. So I'm just hoping that, caucus and JPAL can do things in the future. We also have a very big speaker event every year. It's an annual event. We have had speakers like Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Shiv Shankar Menon, and all, the experts in their various respective fields. So I really hope that JPAL can make inroads into Indian colleges like Hindu college as well. So that would really give us immense opportunities and avenues for learning. Once again, ma'am, I thank you personally as well as JPAL for helping us in organizing this. And once after you leave, then we'll also keep on discussing UBI for some time. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Sure, great. I'm glad that it could spark some discussion, and I'm glad you also found the presentation useful. I'll definitely share that with you. And thanks so much for inviting me, and it was great meeting you all and talking to you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.